Hello and welcome to today's webinar on strategies for reviewing notes. Today we're going to be discussing a few ways that you can add in a process of note review in order to enhance your learning experience in a vigorous academic environment. There are two key reasons that you might want to be reviewing your notes. The first is when you're taking a course with significant content that you need to memorize. We see this most frequently with science courses or language courses, but it might also be helpful to review your notes when you're taking a course in which you frequently feel lost or you have trouble following the course material. This might be something that's topic related or subject related, but sometimes you might have a professor whose lecture style does not mesh well with your learning style. And if that's the case, incorporating this element of note review can help you increase your learning so that you can still get something out of classes, even if it feels like you've been disconnected from them. We are going to be looking at three different impetuses for understanding why you're reviewing your notes. If you know why you're reviewing your notes, that why can help you define your strategy. There isn't one correct way to incorporate note review. It will depend on what your goal is in incorporating this process. The three different whys that we're going to discuss strategies for today. One is reviewing notes to assist with retention of big picture ideas. This is if you are understanding the material, but you're not necessarily remembering the major concepts, or even if you find yourself understanding them when not prompted, but when it comes to test taking, you are struggling to make those connections. The second method we're going to be discussing is if you're reviewing notes for your memorization of specific terms or vocab. Again, with those science or language-based courses, how can you incorporate note review in order to help you memorize specific details? And finally, we're going to be moving into how reviewing notes can help you when you need to make sense of what happened during class, when you feel lost in lectures, lost in readings, and can't place yourself in either of those worlds. And that is what we're going to break down first when you are reviewing notes to make sense of what happened during class. If this is a situation you find yourself in frequently, that element of note review can help you slow down and pick out the ideas that you recorded that maybe you missed in the moment of a class session. What is the goal here? The goal with this note review is to restructure overwhelming concepts in order to identify the core ideas. You've taken notes, you have all this content, you may have other elements as well, slides or readings, and if it all just looks like white noise to you, it's all this static that you can't create meaning out of, your main goal here is to create that meaning. And you can do that by using structure as a tool. One way to sort of create this meaning is to identify the context for new information that you have acquired by making connections to other information that you have. What does this mean? So you may be going into a class session having done readings and you don't understand the readings, you don't understand the course material, you have these notes that you also don't understand. It's not going to help you to increase this understanding by looking at more information in everything. Instead, you want to narrow your scope and see if you can identify one major idea that can be the beginning of a link to bridge from a past experience to help you understand your current experience. So one way to do this is to connect your notes to other assignments. Maybe you didn't understand a lecture, but you did understand your reading, or you did have a worksheet that made sense. Based on what you think the main takeaway from your worksheet or reading was, how does that connect to these notes? What's the main way that these notes seem to add on to that reading? With this kind of note review, you're basically looking over however many notes you took, pages worth, 1 page worth, random markings on a PowerPoint, and you are trying to isolate one or two major ideas. It's not about making meaning out of all the text, but instead figuring out what is the key textual premise here. This can also be helpful if maybe you didn't understand your past assignments, but you understood the other class sessions. Maybe you started a new unit and you are confused about what you're working on now. A good place to start could be thinking, what were we talking about last class or last unit? What in one sentence or a few words was the main idea there? And how does what we talked about today in class, or how do these notes connect to that main idea? Again, looking at that context and seeing how this set of notes fits into that prior discussion can help you build some of those connections. Another great place to look for the context that you might need to help make meaning of your notes is to use syllabus clues to identify those major concepts. Many professors will write on their syllabus under a class session or a unit what the goal is or what the learning objective is. My strategy as a student was often to ignore those textual notes. But if you're feeling lost, that learning objective can be basically the anchor to help you determine what you should be focused on. The learning objective is that your professor gives you, or sometimes that a textbook gives you, is essentially a cheat sheet for showing you what you should be most focused on. So this can yet again be another way to develop context when you have a series of notes that don't seem to have a context. A great strategy for trying to create a sense of order in notes that maybe don't make sense to you when you're reading over them again is reverse outlining. A reverse outline is when you look at text that doesn't have that sort of order of operations in terms of what's the main idea and what are the sub ideas, and you create that structure based on how you see the story as being told. With this strategy, you're going to parse through dense details to identify the structural narrative underneath. With this in mind, if you're looking over 3 pages of notes you took and they don't make sense, begin with, for large quantities of text, identifying which sentences contain main ideas versus which ones provide supporting details. So just like in the bullets in my slide, the main ideas will form a story that provides a brief summary of the class. And those main ideas, you isolate those as the headings in your outline structure. And then you can restructure examples and details as subsections underneath those main ideas. So if you're looking over your notes and you can pick out the main ideas, what is a main idea and what is an example, even just figuring out those main ideas, underlining them, bracketing them, if highlighting them, if these are written notes, if they're typed notes, you can bold them, have a different indentation. If you can figure out which are the main ideas and focus solely on those while using the examples as support, but not focusing on them, that can help you better understand, again, the primary message of what the class is trying to convey. If you can understand the role of the words, then that can be a helpful beginning to understanding the meaning of the words. We're going to move on to the next reason you might have for reviewing your notes, which is reviewing notes for retention of the big picture ideas. So this is going over strategies for how to approach note review if you have difficulty remembering key ideas after you've left the classroom. And how can you try to re-engage with the big picture in a different way? The goal with this element of note review is to think through how main ideas connect to one another while actively engaging with the main ideas instead of passively accepting them. To a certain extent, a lot of the strategies we just talked about can be helpful for this element of note review as well. The idea of doing a reverse outline can help you with this goal as well in terms of isolating those main ideas. The added element here is how can you move from passively accepting information to actively engaging with ideas. What this means is sometimes when you read an idea or are told an idea, it makes sense to you, you understand it, but you don't remember it. But when you are presenting the idea, rewriting it, rethinking about it, then that's going to help with the retention piece. This is sort of like the situation where maybe someone explains a new concept to you or a new vocab term and asks you if you understand it, and you say, sure, yeah, because you do. And then 10 minutes later, they ask you to repeat it back to them, and you can't. It's like you understood it, but now it's lost. With this sort of approach to reviewing notes, the goal is how can you practice presenting that information so that you're thinking through it in a way that will help with retention. If you immediately have to explain that vocab word back to someone as soon as they tell it to you, it forces you to really push past just understanding and develop the neural connections that will lead to better retention. A great way to do this is to reinterpret ideas that you have written down and copied, or reinterpret ideas that are on a slideshow into your own words. Synthesizing ideas mentally helps you process them in a different way, which can help with retention. So if you are, again, actively rewriting the ideas instead of just reading them, you're going to remember them better. A few ways to do this. One is to write a one-paragraph summary of a class session. This could be something that is a more thorough approach to studying. Maybe you have a test coming up and you look over one class session and you want to write out the main idea in one paragraph. This can be helpful because the process of taking a lot of information and trying to condense it, that involves an element of decision making that ultimately makes you have to process the information. If one paragraph feels like too much work to be doing regularly, This could even be a one-sentence summary. You could, after each class, before you leave the classroom or before you leave the building, read over your notes and write down that one-sentence summary. Or do it that night before you start homework for that class. Skim your notes or read them deeply and just write out one sentence. What do you think is the main idea here? Similarly, you can write a one-sentence summary for each class slide. This might be an easier approach for classes that have a lot of technical jargon and you have 10 definitions for organs as part of a system in anatomy crammed onto one slide. How can you turn those details into a one-sentence summary that creates the context or the big picture for how they fit together? So that approach makes a lot more sense for a science-based course where often you're trained to look at the details first before the big picture, and you sometimes need to create that big picture. If writing is less helpful to you or exhausting, you can also try recording yourself talking through a summary of a class session. This can be helpful in the sense that it puts you on the spot again, that it makes you process things differently. You may have heard that sometimes teaching information to others is a great way of learning, and trying to synthesize lots of ideas into one brief recording can be a good way to mimic that. I mentioned the element of recording because sometimes having a recording versus just speaking, it makes it feel more concrete and puts a little bit more pressure on in a way that might challenge you and force you to stick to this exercise. Potentially, if listening and speaking are ways that you really learn well, having a verbal summary that you've recorded could also potentially be a future resource that you use again when trying to review content. Instead of reading your notes, is listening to your summary going to be a more helpful way to begin the process? It's a lot of ideas and opportunities there. From here, we're going to move on to reason 3 you might have for reviewing your notes. Reviewing notes for memorization of specific terms or vocab. Frequent exposure to certain terms allows you to gradually increase your ability to recall that information. So if you're in a course or a program that has memorization as a key aspect of it, frequent exposure is going to be more helpful than less exposure for longer chunks of time. The goal with this frequent exposure is to practice forgetting and remembering content. Every time that you forget information and then remember it again, you strengthen the neural pathway in your brain that helps you find that piece of information. With that in mind, forgetting is essentially part of memorization. You need to forget and remember it in order to really develop a strong pathway, a strong bridge to that information that you can rely upon. For a lot of science courses and language courses, spaced repetition is a popular way to approach this. This is the idea of exposure to material over a longer period of time through frequent, intentionally spaced out study blocks, which again works because your brain is practicing the forgetting and remembering of information so that those neural connections become stronger. With the spaced repetition, you are maybe setting aside time after every class, maybe every day, maybe 2 or 3 times a week to review notes, to review content. If this is part of your routine, maybe the spaced repetition of reading over your notes is all you need to develop this stronger connection. For others, the idea of having note review might be an opportunity to create other materials that you're going to use for spaced repetition. It might be an opportunity for you to create flashcards, for example. With the process of spaced repetition, essentially you are scheduling these regular blocks so that you know I'm going to be sitting down with this material, these notes at this time every day or every other day or however many days makes sense and is realistic for you to maintain. When developing this kind of schedule, you should prioritize shorter, more frequent study blocks over infrequent and longer study blocks. So plan a session in which you create your study materials. This could mean that you have once a week, you have one longer study block during which you create your vocab lists, your flashcards, or your Quizlets. And then maybe more frequently throughout the week, you schedule shorter, more regular time to review the resources. Again, with spaced repetition, it's quantity of time more so than the quality that increases that exposure, which is going to help with retention. In terms of what those potential study materials you create for this are, it is going to depend on what works best for you. Some of the classic methods are Quizlets or written flashcards, Anki for sciences. There are a lot of popular methods that work for a reason. They're easy to create or they allow for quick review. Something that is important to think about when deciding how to review these materials is to determine what works best for you and when do you feel the most confident in material that you've learned. Do you feel most confident when reading it, when writing it, or when reciting it? Do you study well in groups or with the recordings? And depending on what works best for you, that is how you should develop this plan. In considering ways to strengthen those neural connections to your brain, to terms within your brain, not only is it helpful to strengthen those connections through frequency, but if you have more than one way to connect to a meaning, that can create an additional pathway that can make it easier to remember. The best way to implement this easily is using colors to make categorical associations. If you're visually inclined and you find that having visual cues helps you learn better, maybe anytime you have a term that relates to a specific system of the body, you highlight those terms in a certain color. Having that extra layer of association can again help you with retention because you have another element to help you out with remembering. Maybe you can remember the visual and the green, and that's going to be a good way to help you connect. If you feel like you learn better through writing, maybe you're going to practice writing a term out in a different color or writing it out on a different colored piece of paper. If the recitation is the best for you, maybe then you are going to say a vocab term out loud as you're reading your flashcard. Or as I mentioned before, maybe you have those recordings and you listen to them again. It's helpful to know which method works best for you and to try to incorporate some element of that into your review. we're going to finish up with a few tips on how to be realistic with your planning when implementing an element of note review into your schedule that might not exist yet. You should be realistic in terms of when you can actually make space for this task and when you will be able to prioritize it. The best plan, I like to think, is a realistic plan. And with a task that is not necessarily deadline motivated, such as note review, it's important to plan it for a time of day or week when you don't regularly have another deadline due. Because if you have something else that's due, you're immediately going to prioritize that. Maybe not always, but frequently. So if you have a discussion post due every Sunday night for one class that you're always kind of last minute on finishing up, it doesn't make sense to make that your regular note review time for a different class. So think about a time when you can really stick to making it the priority, when nothing else will take priority. And think as well about how you can make it more automatic. For some folks, having note review right after a class can be easier because you're already in the mindset of that class. If you have a biology course and then you sit down with the notes after for another 30 minutes, then that's easier. It's just an extension of the class. Or alternately, if you're exhausted and that's difficult to do, what about the flip side? Can you make time 30 minutes before that class to help you get in the mindset of a class session by reviewing the last class's notes? That's a great way to provide context before going into the class so that you'll follow along more easily. It's also a great way to automatically incorporate spaced repetition. If you have a class on Monday and you're looking at the notes before the next class on Wednesday, it might seem a little unfamiliar, but then you're going to remember it better for having looked at it a few days later. If you are adding note review onto a bigger homework block, I would also encourage you to try putting it at the beginning of a homework block instead of the end. Often, if we are deadline focused, we'll put the most urgent thing first in our homework block. And then if we're too tired, we don't get to the extra elements that are not time sensitive. So sometimes it can be helpful to put that non-urgent task first because you know you're going to work to get the more urgent deadline-based assignment finished. And I also think it's helpful to limit how long you're spending on reviewing your notes. The goal with this shouldn't be perfectionism because that can be difficult to maintain. How long do you want to reasonably allow yourself to spend on this? And how can you make sure you don't go over that time? If you tell yourself you're going to spend 20 minutes after class and you spend an hour and a half the first time you do it, it's unlikely you're going to be able to sustain that. So think about how you can set a timer or go through your notes more quickly or change what you're doing in terms of how you process those notes. And anytime you're developing new habits, it's important to start with those realistic goals and work towards aspirational goals. Start small, add one habit at a time. So again, start with that smaller, that more approachable note review block of 20 minutes and work up to that bigger block of an hour. And by adding one habit at a time, it is going to be more helpful to begin with that note review for one class at a time instead of trying to add in all of your courses at once. Figure out your minimum goal and commit to it. Because again, if we aim for that maximum goal, that can make it unsustainable, and making sure you have a minimum that you're committed to. Example, just looking at your notes. 5 minutes could be your minimum goal. That's going to be a helpful building block that you can build upon. And as I mentioned before, you want to make it easy to prioritize this and avoid being a perfectionist. And also know that if something isn't working with your system, you can always change it. I already got into this a little bit, but a term that relates to timing your review sessions around classes is the idea of habit stacking. Habit stacking is when you add a new routine to your day by stacking it on top of a pre-existing routine. My favorite example of this is if you are brushing your teeth and you want to start adding into your morning routine, looking at your planner. Brushing your teeth is an automatic habit that you do. So maybe you can schedule in looking at your planner after you've done that. It's easier to add a new routine if you don't have to pull it out of nowhere, and instead you can rely on other routines to help you develop that. That's why the idea of reviewing notes before or after classes can be helpful. You're already in that class mindset. It can be helpful just between class sessions that are different classes, which works because it's a brief period of time that's often not used very well. Or again, putting it at the beginning of a study session. If you get into the routine of every time you're doing homework, you start with note review, that makes it easier to develop those habits. And in order to develop these routines, you want to know when and where you will be reviewing your notes so that beginning the process occurs more organically. If you have to will this process into existence in the middle of a longer homework session, it's less likely to happen than if you have pre-planned when you're going to sit down with this process. If you have any questions, feel free to add them to the chat. We also have some other note-taking resources on our YouTube channel if you want to explore some of this content a little bit more, as well as a note-taking webpage on our website. If you don't have any questions, thanks so much for joining me today, and have a great rest of your day.